6 weeks ago, our gospel reading came from the 8th chapter of Mark's gospel. In that reading, we heard Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. He responds to a question being asked by his friend Jesus, "Who do people say that I am?" And they give him some answers. And he says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ. You're the Messiah." Now, 6 weeks ago is a long time ago, I admit. I can't even remember what I was doing 6 days ago. And since in my job I move around the diocese, I was going to look it up on my phone. I forgot between the 8 o'clock service and the 10:17 service. I was going to look up to see where I was 6 weeks ago. I don't remember. But perhaps you were here in this room. That declaration at Caesarea Philippi represents a turning point in Mark's gospel. And from that moment until today's gospel reading, which just came from the 10th chapter of Mark, we have been on the way to Jerusalem. Jesus has set his face toward Jerusalem, and we are on the way. The total distance between Galilee and Jerusalem is about 120 miles, which is roughly the same distance as Stockbridge to Boston. It would have taken Jesus and his disciples about 6 days or so to make this journey, covering about 20 miles or so a day. As it happens, that's almost exactly the same pace that our bishop took when he walked this diocese, including Worcester County last fall, when he walked from Trinity Milford to this congregation. I didn't walk all of it with him, but I walked some of it with him. Someone had to be back at the office keeping track of where he was, too. But along the way, we got to talk, because 20 miles a day leaves a lot of room for discussion. And so in Mark's gospel, the stuff that we've been hearing about over these past 6 weeks is what Mark remembers as the highlights of that pilgrimage. This morning we reached the suburbs of Jericho, which is only about 15 miles from the city limits of Jerusalem. So they're on the last leg of this journey. In liturgical time, because Episcopalians love liturgical time, it's basically almost Palm Sunday, right? Just hours before Jesus will enter the city of Jerusalem on a donkey, and the crowds will shout, "Hosanna, Son of David," and lay their palm branches before him. That's where we are in the gospel. While Peter's eyes were opened in that moment at Caesarea Philippi, it has been clear, however, ever since, that the disciples had the experience but missed the meaning. Jesus has been talking all the way about the meaning of the cross, about why he's going to Jerusalem. But they keep missing the point. He puts a child into their midst. He tells them the last will be first. He tells them they must be servants of all. But they are very slow learners. This actually gives me great faith. If the disciples were that slow, maybe there's some hope for us. Just last week, in fact, we heard the sons of Zebedee, do you remember? Jockeying for position, running up to Jesus and saying, "Can we be on your right hand and your left hand? Can we be Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in your new administration when you come into Jerusalem?" And Jesus just says, "Oh, my goodness. You don't get it. You still don't get it." So Jesus and his disciples were neither the first Galileans nor the last to travel to Jerusalem. In fact, this religious pilgrimage was undertaken by faithful Jews as many as 3 times a year, and especially to celebrate high holy days like Passover, which is the reason that Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem. The high holy days. And the route that the disciples are taking is the AAA recommended one. And so along the way, there are some beggars, because beggars are very smart. Beggars don't hang out where there aren't any people. Beggars hang out in places like Harvard Square or Grand Central Station or the exit and entrance ramp off 290 in Worcester, which I take every day when I drive to Springfield. And of course, well-traveled roads like the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. So we should not be surprised that there's a blind beggar in Jericho. There's lots of blind beggars in Jericho. But this story, today's gospel, is about one of those blind beggars, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, or as I like to call him, Timmy's boy. We've heard plenty of these kinds of stories from Mark already about how Jesus healed people in and around Galilee before this journey to Jerusalem began. And we have heard about how he can make the blind see and the deaf hear, and about how he healed the woman with the hemorrhage, and about how he raised Jairus' daughter. And so it comes as no big surprise that Jesus is going to make the blind son of Timaeus see. And so Timmy's boy cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And when he does that, it makes him the first person in Mark's gospel to use that title for Jesus. We've come all this way since the Jordan River. Remember, at the Jordan, God says, "This is my beloved, my son, with whom I am well pleased." And we've heard Jesus speak of himself as the Son of Man. And we've heard Peter recognize Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, in Caesarea Philippi. But now, as we are about to get to the city gates of Jerusalem, and just before the crowds will wave their palm branches and make this very same claim, this blind man sees that Jesus is the long-awaited Son of David. Timaeus' kid sees what nobody else has been able to see, that is about to dawn a new day. And as you heard, he makes a scene. He embarrasses people. He cries out, and literally he is silenced by the crowd. "Shh, be quiet." And he cries out, shouts out all the more, "I will not be quiet. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And then, did you notice this? And then Jesus invites Bartimaeus, to come to him. Not the other way around. I find this detail fascinating. Jesus doesn't go to Bartimaeus, but rather calls Bartimaeus, the blind kid, to come to him. Wouldn't it have been more compassionate if Jesus had gone to him? I find this detail fascinating for what it says literally and for what it metaphorically suggests, that Jesus is not an enabler. I don't want to minimize the hardship of being blind or lame or deaf, but sometimes we can allow a person's disabilities to define them and even to eclipse their humanity. And sometimes we let our own disabilities define us. And when we do that, we risk that we stop being fellow travelers on a journey. We're just the blind guy or the deaf guy. And there are hints of that in this text. We don't even know this kid's name. He's just Bartimaeus, Timmy's kid. Timmy's blind kid. Sometimes, if we're not careful, we create dependency rather than truly serving our neighbor. There's a big difference between helping people because it makes us feel good or because we need to be needed, and serving people because we see the image of God in them. And sometimes in our weakness, others make us feel even weaker than we are. And sometimes people do for us what we could be doing for ourselves. The difference, I think, has to do with respecting the dignity of every human being. As a pastor, I've sometimes been around a couple where I'm trying to ask the person who is perhaps dying or has been sick a whole bunch of questions, but their spouse keeps answering on their behalf. And I understand how that happens. But I also understand that what Jesus does here is treat Bartimaeus as a human being, as a beloved child of God. And in so doing, I think he is already working toward making him whole. which is about more than making his retinal nerves work. And so Jesus calls Bartimaeus to come to him. And Bartimaeus leaps up and tosses off his cloak, literally, before he regains his sight. Think about that for a minute. The tossing of his cloak is a bridge-burning act. The coat is the means by which a blind beggar gathers in coins tossed to him by those who are coming by. He puts his coat out there, they throw the coins on it, he pulls the coat into himself, and he gathers his coins. He throws this away while he's still blind, while he's trying to find his way to Jesus. What Mark, I think, is telling us is that this man completely trusts that Jesus is about to transform his life. And that is about more than healing his physical blindness. He is not going to be a beggar anymore. He's not going to be Timmy's boy, that blind beggar. He is growing into the full stature of Christ. And then again, Jesus puts things back on Bartimaeus. He says to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" It's tempting to spoof the response, as if Bartimaeus might say, "Hello, son of David, I'm blind. What do you think I want, milk and cookies? I'd like to see again." But I think this falls under the very same heading. Jesus treats Bartimaeus as a person. Bartimaeus is asked to articulate what he needs, what he desires, what he yearns for. And sometimes we need to do that too. We need to put words to it. We need to name it. And so I have no problem believing that it happened just this way, that this is who Jesus is, but I also think this story is laden with implications that ripple down through the centuries to this very room at 10:17 on a Sunday morning. I think we are meant to chuckle at how Timaeus' blind kid sees better than the disciples who Jesus really is and what he is about. And as he regains his sight, he becomes a follower on the way. That's what Mark says. Which means he's headed with them to Jerusalem, that he gets the cross is ahead. And apparently has no illusions about that. But he has been touched by the amazing grace of Jesus. He who once was blind now sees. And this is such an amazing gift that he cannot but help to respond with his life. And I also think that we are meant to wonder on this Sunday morning about our own blindness, or at least our own blind spots. Sometimes we're tempted in our hubris to think we see it all. This is a great illusion. Each of us sees what we want to see, or what we're able to see, and usually from a pretty narrow perspective. I can see all of you right now, most of you. Some of you are hidden behind some of these pillars. I can't see anything that's going on back here. I don't know if they're making faces at me or not. Are they? Are they behaving back there? Yeah, they all right? We only see what we see, and sometimes we don't know what we don't see. And none of us has 20/20 vision, at least not in the spiritual sense. And so much is hidden from our understanding. And always we are looking through the glass darkly. Part of spiritual maturity, as I understand it, is beginning to see things in new ways from new angles. But I also think part of spiritual maturity is becoming more profoundly aware that we do not see it all. We do not have all the answers. And that what we do see is only a sliver of what might be seen. And therefore we need others. Therefore we need congregations like this one. Therefore we need other people who will help us to see in our blind spots and call us out and love us into seeing new things. In our own journeys, we are at times tempted to sit back and wait for Jesus to come to us. But what I think is so powerful about this text this morning is that the journey of faith begins with Bartimaeus groping in the dark and crying out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And he has to stumble along to find his way. And I think it's like that for us sometimes. And perhaps it's incumbent upon us to cry out in the darkness and to ask for what we need, or at least for what we think we need. And then do our best to get up and move. This is not magic, but it does require our participation and great risk, and trust that Christ is there. It requires courage. Faith like this. Is your desire to see strong enough for you to be willing to throw off the coat that you rely on in your present blindness? Jesus doesn't make faith easy for us. And I think that's because he respects us too much. He insists that we make our way to him, not because he isn't pastoral, but because the struggle to find him is part of the gift and part of the journey. And prayer is, at least in part, prayer is about learning to articulate what we need. And there is spiritual growth that comes simply by learning to be able to articulate what it is we're asking for. What is it you want me to do for you? God says. Well, being succinct is not one of my gifts. So if your mind has wandered, let me just give you a succinct summary from a commentator I read this week that I think summarizes well what I've been trying to say. And then I'll wrap it up. Ched Myers writes, discipleship depends upon whether or not we really want to see our weary world as it truly is, without denial, without delusion, the tough realities, the inconvenient truths about economic disparity, about racial oppression, about ecological destruction, and war without end. And to see our beautiful world as it truly could and should be, free of despair and distraction, the divine dream of enough for all and the beloved community and restored creation and the peaceable kingdom. Do we dare to see? Do we want to see? All of this is gift. All of this is sheer grace. And it is true, as this little banner says, it is true that God really is the giver. But we still need to receive the gift. God is the giver, but sometimes if we're like this and sitting in the dark and we won't move, we will not receive the gift. We need to open our hands, we need to open our minds, we need to open our lives, we need to take a step. I know that in this congregation, as across our diocese, that you all are praying about stewardship and about your own giving, as we are in my own household. There is no magic formula for this. But we must dare, we must be courageous enough to not just write the same number down that we've been writing down for the last 10 years. We must be courageous enough to move beyond being tippers, or of acting as if the church is just one more charity in the midst of a pledge drive. In the recognition that Jesus is the one who gives us sight, in recognition that Jesus is the one who claims and marks and seals us for the living God, in recognition that all is gift, we are changed. And in seeing who Jesus is, Son of Man, Son of David, Messiah, Son of the living God, God's own beloved, in seeing who He is, we begin to recognize and see who we are and who we are called to become. And I think to see that what we say is true, that all that we have and all that we are is gift from the living God. The practice of faithful stewardship does not end there, but always it begins with our ability to see that and to claim that. And then, like blind Bartimaeus, to respond. Because we who were once blind now see. So may we receive the gift of God's amazing grace, and may it change our lives, and may we continue to follow Jesus along the way.